First Nations in Alberta are a group of people who live in the Canadian province of Alberta. The First Nations are peoples, or nations, recognized as Indigenous peoples or Plains Indians in Canada excluding the Inuit and the Métis. According to the 2011 census, a population of 116,670 Albertans self-identified as First Nations. Specifically, there were 96,730 First Nations people with registered Indian status and 19,945 First Nations people without registered Indian status. Alberta has the third largest First Nations population among the provinces and territories, after Ontario and British Columbia. From this total population, 47.3% of the population lives on an Indian reserve and the other 52.7% live in urban centres. According to the 2011 census, the First Nations population in Edmonton, the provincial capital, totaled at 31,780, which is the second highest for any city in Canada, after Winnipeg. The First Nations population in Calgary, in reference to the 2011 census, totaled at 17,040. 3. There are 48 First Nations or bands in Alberta, in the sense of governments made up of a council and a chief, belonging to 9 different ethnic groups or tribes based on their ancestral languages. There are a variety of ways of classifying the various First Nations groups in Alberta. In anthropological terms, there are 2 broad cultural groupings in Alberta based on different climactic, ecological regions and the ways of life adapted to those regions. In the northern part of the province, the Subarctic peoples relied on boreal species such as moose, woodland caribou, etc. as their main prey animals, extensively practiced ice fishing, and utilized canoes, snowshoes, and toboggans for transportation. The Plains Indians of the south lived primarily in a prairie grasslands environment, but with access as well to the nearby Rocky Mountains, and relied on the plains bison, or buffalo, as their major food source and used the travois for transportation. Peoples in the central, aspen parkland belt of Alberta practiced hybrid cultures with features of both the aforementioned groups. At the time of contact with Euro-Canadian observers, all of the Indigenous peoples in Alberta belonged to several overlapping groups, lodges, bands, tribes, and confederacies. The smallest unit was the lodge, which is what observers called an extended family or any other group living in the same dwelling such as a teepee or wigwam. Several lodges living together formed a band. Bands were highly mobile small groups consisting of a respected, male leader sometimes called a chief, possibly his extended family, and other unrelated families. The band was a fundamental unit of organization, as a band was large enough to defend itself and engage in communal hunts, yet small enough to be mobile and to make decisions by consensus. Leaders had only charismatic authority and no coercive power. Lodges and individuals were free to leave bands, and bands regularly split in 2 or merged with another, yet no one would want to be without the protection of living in a band for very long. Bands among the pagan people in southern Alberta ranged in size from 10 to 30 lodges, or about 80 to 240 persons. By contrast, a tribe is an ethnic affiliation. A tribe is a group of people who recognize each other as compatriots due to shared language and culture. Bands from the same tribe, speaking the same language, usually relied on each other as allies against outsiders. But in Alberta, tribes were not institutionalized, and decision-making consisted of leaders from various bands meeting together in council to reach consensus. There are approximately 9 Indigenous ethnic or tribal groups in Alberta in the 21st century, depending on how they are counted. They are the Beaver, Dainza, Blackfoot, Nyatzaitarpi, Chipien, Dinezalin, Plains Cree, Pasquoyinawak, Sarsi, Tsutina, Saltks, Plains Ojibwa, Nakay, Slavey, Deemthar, Stony, Nakoda, and the Woodland Cree, Sakoydinawak. Within these boundaries there is much fluidity. However, as intermarriages and bilingual bands were once very common. Scholar Neil MacLeod points out that bands were loose, temporary groupings which were often polyethnic and multilingual, so that most mentions of the Cree by historians of previous decades actually refer to mixed Cree Assiniboine Saltix groups. As well, the smallpox outbreak of 1780 to 1781 and the whooping cough outbreak of 1819 to 1820 decimated many bands, forcing them to merge with neighbors. Anthropologists and others often group peoples together based on which language family their ancestral language is from, as peoples with related languages often also have cultural similarities. All of the groups presently represented in Alberta belong to one of three large language families, and are related to other languages across the continent. These are the Algonquian, Blackfoot, Cree, and Saltks, the Athabaskan Ordine, Beaver, Chipien, Slavey, and Sarsi, and the Siwan, Stony, families. The list of tribal groups in Alberta is not fixed and is based on differing interpretations of what constitutes a tribe. The Blackfoot people consist of three dialect groups who were close allies: the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. They are sometimes considered separate tribes or nations in their own right. The largest First Nations cultural group by population in Alberta is the Cree, if the Woodlands Cree and Plains Cree are counted together. 32 First Nations bands in Alberta are affiliated with Cree culture and are related to other Cree peoples across Canada as far east as Labrador. The Woodland Cree practised a Subarctic culture, and the Plains Cree a Plains culture, and they spoke different but related dialects of the Cree language. Several peoples in Alberta fall under the term Dene, which is a name used by many related peoples in the Northwest Territories. In Alberta this includes the Beaver, Chipien, Slavey, and Sarsi. All Dene peoples share similar spiritual beliefs and social organization, but the Sarsi people are a Plains people, while the others are Subarctic. The Stony people are related to the Assiniboine and Sioux and may be considered a branch of either of those groups. The Stony themselves are divided into woodlands, Poor and Alexis bands, and Plains sections, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Welsey bands. The Saltks people are represented by only one band in Alberta, the Ochies First Nation. The many other Saltks bands in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, however, and the Saltks themselves are a branch of the larger Ojibwe and Anishinaabe groups. Besides all of these groups, there are also non-status Indians of mixed Cree Iroquois origin living in Hinton Grand Cache region of the Rocky Mountains and foothills. They are represented by the Asiniuquinwak Nation of Canada, which is a non-for-profit society and not a band under the Indian Act. Other tribes are known to have inhabited Alberta in the past. The Cluny Earth Lodge village at Blackfoot Crossing is a unique in Canada example of a permanent fortified village of earth lodges probably built around 1740 CE by Hidatsa or Mandan peoples. 910. The Assiniboine people lived in Alberta at the time of European contact, and it is thought that the Stony people who still live in the province began as a branch of the Assiniboine. Early accounts by European explorers suggest that the eastern Chilzone are thought to have lived in Alberta before being displaced by in Blackfoot by 1787. 12. The Gros Ventres were reported living in two north-south tribal groups. 1. The so-called Fall Indians, Canadian or Northern group, of 260 lodges. 2,500 population, traded with the Northwest Company on the Saskatchewan River and roamed between the Missouri and Bow Rivers. They were active in southern Alberta through the late 1800s, but were based near present-day Fort Belknap, Montana by 1862 when Jesuit missionaries arrived there.